This. Okay. Sorry, I thought that was going to be off. All right. I'm Jen Judson. I'm the land warfare reporter for Defense News, but also the 115th president of the National Press Club. And so, welcome to the National Press Club, where news happens. We're looking forward to a robust discussion today with MSNBC reporter Daniela Pierre-Bravo. And we're also happy to take questions from the audience. So, if you have a question today, please raise your hand. I'll turn it over to the audience for any questions toward the end. But if you have a burning question, this is a small enough audience where I can call on you throughout if you want. If you're a woman of color, an immigrant, or the child of immigrants, you've probably experienced firsthand the difference between fitting in and belonging. Whether at school, at work, or in the community, people who are labeled as other often struggle to feel comfortable and succeed. They feel they must shapeshift or contort themselves into something they're not, just to fit into the dominant culture. Belonging is something completely different. Real belonging means being yourself and thriving in any environment. Daniela Pierre-Bravo started her career as someone highly skilled at fitting in, something she excelled at as a child and in school, and she was an undocumented immigrant and a Latina who wanted desperately to be accepted. Today, she truly belongs. She belongs at her high-powered job at MSNBC. She belongs as a best-selling author and speaker, and she belongs right here at the National Press Club. Putting herself through college selling Mary Kay cosmetics with restaurant jobs, house cleaning, and side hustles, Pierre-Bravo writes about taking an all-night bus with only a change of clothing from Ohio to New York City, where she landed an internship with Bad Boy Entertainment, the company founded by music mogul Sean Combs, then known as P. Diddy. She couldn't fly to the job interview because as an undocumented person, she had no ID. She couldn't drive for the same reason. She didn't have a driver's license. Daniela wanted to follow the rules, but her undocumented status made that impossible. She constantly feared being exposed or even deported to Chile, the country she left when she was 11 years old. There was shame and anger about being called an illegal. She compensated by always trying to be the first, the best, the most eager to please. Her book, The Other, How to Own Your Power at Work, is a story of how she evolved from struggling to fit in to owning her place at the table. The life lessons she learned are valuable for anyone starting a career, for experienced professionals trying to advance, or for leaders and managers who want to build a diverse and thriving culture at work. Please give a warm National Press Club welcome to Daniela Pierre-Bravo. Danielle, I'm just going to move straight into Q&A.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say that was one of the best intros I've had so far, so thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So I would love to get started on you talking a little bit about your move from Chile to Ohio. So talk about what that experience was like for you.
You know, I grew up with hardworking parents who tried really hard to give us this idea of the American dream, and they didn't answer a lot of questions of, you know, why we were here and all of the things that you think might have been naturally talked about weren't. And so I think there was a lot of confusion. And when I talked to other immigrants like me, other children of immigrants, there are so many conflicting emotions because, especially for undocumented people and DACA recipients like me, you grow up with family who is so used to being in survival mode and a family who has sacrificed so much to give you an opportunity to have a better life. But at the same time, I had trouble kind of reckoning with my own sense of shame about my situation because when I was in high school and going into college, I didn't know any other undocumented people. I didn't even know that there were other DACA recipients like me. So I internalized a lot of shame and it felt really lonely.
Yeah.
And you add on to that this sort of under the surface resentment towards the very people that sacrificed so much to get you where you are. And, you know, it's complicated. And, you know, part of this book goes to talk about those feelings because we oftentimes blame ourselves when we don't understand what's happening and why. and we are made to feel like the other because we've constantly seen ourselves through the eyes of somebody else, and that has given us psychological safety. And so this book, is about kind of breaking down those layers about the origin of our otherness, and really showing that at the end of the day, it has nothing to do with us, but everything to do with the person that has labeled that towards us. It's a projection of fear, it's a projection of limited understanding, it's a projection of insecurities. And that this book has so much about owning back your power at work. So it has great tips on negotiating and advocating, which we can get into today. But if you don't reckon with your own identity and your sense of self and your value, right, then you can never put that hand in hand with those great pieces of advice and actually make it substantive to your career.
Yeah, absolutely. When did you first learn you were not a U.S. citizen? What was your reaction to that when you first realized that was a hurdle?
We never had, I always get that question, and we never had like a conversation when my parents sat me down and said, you're going to have difficulty because you're undocumented. All I remember is, not talking about it and crossing the border and, being told that I needed to, put my head down and, don't answer anybody's questions. And then we got to Ohio, and my parents were busy working 2 and 3 jobs, and I was busy trying to fit in and assimilating. So we never had that conversation. But I started to see the realities of it when, I wanted to get my driver's license, and it all of a sudden said, yeah, we don't have an ID for you. You can't get your driver's license. Or when I wanted to apply for colleges, and A, I didn't come from a family who knew the American college system, and B, I didn't have the proper document to apply. So I found out like sprinkles of information at really bad times. Yeah. But again, there was never like that talk about you're undocumented.
Yeah. There was a story that you tell in your book about meeting your boyfriend's family for the first time, and I thought that was, it's very interesting. I actually went to college in Ohio, so I'm a little familiar, but, like you said, you were the only undocumented person that you knew. So talk a little bit about your experience as you, grew up in Ohio when you were in junior high and high school. And what that was like encountering those types of situations where, somebody might not say quite the right thing.
Yeah.
It
well,
sounded
because
like
it's
you handled
limited
it gracefully,
knowledge, right?
but
Yeah. So I'll tell an anecdote quickly. And it was one of those things in the book where I started writing it, and when you're writing a book, there's like a lot of different edits, and you just put stuff down and see, to kind of get going, get the creative juices going, see what fits, what resonates. And this was one of the stories that was like really personal, and I'm going back to my hometown like tomorrow to do a speech, so this is going to be interesting. But that story kept coming up after the first edit and the second edit and the third edit, and finally it just stayed in the book. So what happened is, it was my first boyfriend, and he came from a family that was very different than mine. They were well off, very well known in town. The parents went to Ivy Leagues, and I wanted everything. I wanted to go under the radar. Yeah. Like, I knew that my family was very different from them, and I knew questions were going to come up, and I just wanted to be like prepared. I wanted to, do well in their eyes. And I remember my parents dropping me off late because my dad worked at a factory job across town, and he had like a rundown car, and we were always having trouble with our car breaking down, and of course it happened that day. And I remember like opening the loud car and like creaking open while I shut it as I was walking into the restaurant. I'm like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. Hopefully they didn't hear me. And I get in there, and in the middle, we were sharing appetizers, everything was going fine. They were throwing me the usual softballs, where are your parents from, blah, blah, blah. And then we get to the dinner part, and all of a sudden, I thought I was like getting an A+, in their eyes, super nervous. And one of the parents goes, so are you an alien? Do you have your paperwork? Do you have your green card? And I just like, froze up because that was like my worst fear that they would ever have an idea that I didn't have my papers. And I remember one of the siblings at dinner thought they came to my rescue and they were like, no, Mom, she's an undocumented immigrant. And then everybody started laughing because they thought it was so impossible that could be. And I just I think I had like an out-of-body experience at that moment. And I think that was one of those moments where definitively I was like, okay, I'm the problem. Okay, I'm the one that's different. Right, I needed to change, and I had the deficiency. I was the one that was inadequate, and I was never going to belong. And it didn't help that my mom and my grandma, which, by the way, they are amazing Latinas. I call my mom and my grandma every day. They're like my best friends. And they said something that really stayed with me, which was after I told them about that encounter, they said something like, "Oh, you would have never fit in with them, or you would have never, that you wouldn't have just. It would have been something that you would never fit in." Yeah. But it reminded me of that idea of like I would never fit in, right? As if I was the other. As if I was looking from the outside in, and that sort of mentality stuck with me in college and then in my career. So again, it's that like internalizing of the shame about who you are, and those moments where you believe the narratives of what other people are saying about you, and you take them as fact.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk about the challenges that you faced when you were like applying to college and trying to get jobs with your immigration status. You didn't have an ID. So what are some of the ways that you found to apply to college? You did go to college, so how did you do that?
I couldn't apply to I couldn't apply to any colleges online because if you guys remember, there's like a pull down box and it says like citizenship status, and I literally couldn't fit into any of them. Yeah. And you couldn't technically fill out the application online. Yeah. And I remember this was like the saving grace. A guidance counselor brought me into their office. I don't think they knew about my status. And there was this program that Miami University had, which was called the Bridges Program, which gave $2,500, a very small amount that had not, very not close to the total amount of yearly tuition. Yeah. And it basically said that if you came to do a tour on the college campus and you spent the night with a student and did like a whole weekend or weekday thing, you would be given those $2,500 for the first semester. Okay. And they would give you a paper application on the spot. Okay. So I went to the tour not knowing what was going to happen with it. I didn't even ask my parents because I just, at this point I just was like, I have to figure it out on my own. Yeah. I get there and I applied to the paper application and I just left the citizenship box empty. And, I got in, and then the big question about the tuition came up. Yeah. And I had to take off semesters here and there. I would I had worked throughout all of my high school, so I was saving up money under my mattress because I couldn't have a bank account, right? Yeah. So there's all these things that work against you, and you really learn from a young age to kind of problem solve things that nobody tells you about. But that's the way I applied to Miami University. And I went semester by semester not knowing if I was going to graduate because we didn't have the money. I couldn't get federal loans. I couldn't get any type of loans because I couldn't apply for them. And so it was just all cash paying if I was going to make it through. And it was a family effort. I remember, and that's the other thing about, if you're the first of your family, or you have immigrant parents, you have that sense of responsibility on your shoulders. Because I remember, studying, having the luxury of studying for an exam while my entire family, my 4 brothers and sisters, and my mom and my dad would work at a movie theater at nights cleaning so they could send me part of that cash that they would get to school. Wow. So it was definitely a family effort, but that's the immigrant ethos.
Yeah. And I think, it's interesting to hear you talk about how you took the initiative yourself to, get to a college campus and take a tour and apply. I think we see more and more, parents kind of overly involved in their children's efforts to go to school and to succeed. But it seemed like you learned a lot of lessons very independently at a young age. So, how did that help you in your career? I think that I see that as a positive in a way, that you were able to kind of overcome a lot of challenges and problem solve on your own at an early age.
Yeah, well, I don't think that my story, and you mentioned the bus story, so I don't have to repeat that story, but I don't think it's unique at all. I think it's the story of so many women in this country, so many women of color, and so many women that are the first of their families, because it's sink or swim. Like, you don't have another choice than to be that way, because of so much working against you. And, in the workplace, it served me well at the beginning, it still does, that sort of mentality of being scrappy and eager and a yes mentality. And it's what got me noticed when I got myself in the door, and I had to kind of differentiate myself between the other production assistants and the entry-level people. And I remember, this sounds silly, but it's so true. I worked with Mika Brzezinski, and she's my mentor and my sponsor, and just has been amazing to the development of my career. But I started as an NBC page, and I rotated throughout different shows like Saturday Night Live and Jimmy Fallon, and then I got the Morning Joe job because I was like the only page that wanted to work on that early morning show. Yeah. I remember the assignment starting at 3 a.m. and everybody was like, what? We have to wake up at 3 a.m. And I was so excited because I had seen Mika and Joe, and I knew that formula of doing TV was so unique, and I was so attracted to it. And I remember one of the first days backstage, it was like a really busy day behind the scenes, and the coordinator had brought me to Mika's dressing room, and she was very nice, and she asked me, are you going to be getting my coffee? And I was so excited. I was, yes, I'm going to be getting your coffee every morning. And she goes, good, you better not fuck it up. Sorry, I don't know if I can cuss here.
That's okay. You can. There's no children here.
Yeah, and everybody started laughing. Obviously, she's like very sarcastic and funny. But I was like, oh, okay. Like, I didn't know what to do with it. And she was joking, but I kind of took that seriously. Yeah. Because I was like very eager, very, acutely aware of the needs of other people, right? And again, that's like one of the things that comes with somebody who has a dual identity. You understand really acutely what people want from you, and you also understand very acutely people's needs, because that's how you've learned rules of inclusion. So I remember being, the crazy girl that would, knock on Starbucks every morning at like 4:43, and they didn't open until 4:45, and they would roll their eyes every time that I would knock on the door. But I'd have her extra, black-eyed me, so extra hot, extra foam every morning as she walked through the turnstiles. So long story short, that getting the coffee right sort of developed my career a lot quicker. Yeah. As silly as that sounds, because she started taking me to shows with her and events. And it wasn't until 2 years in, really, that I told her my own story, and that's how things shifted. But I want to just make a point here quickly that you mentioned that it's a good quality to have in the workplace, and I wouldn't be where I am if I didn't demonstrate that hard work, scrappiness, problem solving, yes girl mentality. But again, I don't think it's unique. I think a lot of women are that way in the workplace. But the problem is for people like us who have felt like the others and have found safety in following these rules of inclusion, and you add up that idea that these opportunities are fleeting and they depend on somebody else's good graces, you get fixated on being that girl forever. And when it comes time to push back, say no, delegate, ask for more, it's harder and counterintuitive to us. Yep. So that's what this book is about.
Absolutely. So you write about how your parents struggled with multiple jobs, and also that they weren't particularly good at managing money. So how did you learn to manage your finances well enough to put yourself through school and to take on unpaid internships in New York City? I think that would be very useful, I think, to those that will read your book and that follow you.
To be totally honest, it's seeing them not manage their money well and seeing how
By example.
by example on what not to do. And that's hard to say. Like I'm going to be giving a speech to my mom in the audience tomorrow, so that'll be fun. But we've talked so much about, you know, the things that went wrong, the things that went right, the things that, you know, affected my mental health.
Yeah.
And that's hard because if you're from an immigrant community, and especially a Latino community, you don't talk about that. It's survival mode all the way, and your feelings, you just, you know, chin up, you know? And I talk about this when I talk about money because for our communities, that is very intertwined. It's not, I started writing about financial health for Know Your Value, Mika's platform, because I saw a gap between how we talk about financial wellness and how women of color and immigrant communities need to be included in that conversation of financial health. So going back to your initial question, you know, it's hard and it's lonely and you have to do a lot of research on your own. And for me, it was always saving. You know, because I could only have cash and I couldn't have a bank account for a long time, I had cash for everything under my mattress. And I remember I had this agenda and I would work multiple jobs, cash paying jobs at restaurants, and I was a babysitter. And every day, whether it was I made, in Mary Kay, $17 or $110, I would write on my agenda exactly the amount of cash that I made that day. And I would add it up every week and then over the weekend and then every month. So I was very meticulous. And because it was all cash, everything felt so, you could see it. So I knew exactly the things that I couldn't spend on, nor did I want to spend on, because I had a very clear goal, and that was my education. And then it was New York.
So I think this is a good segue for a question. In one of your later chapters, you talk about earning and how to maximize, you know, your earning potential, and you mentioned, I thought that was actually really interesting, that Latinas are actually the lowest paid out of all women of color, and also women, because women are still underpaid from, you know, when we talk about white men. You know, what are your thoughts, or do you have any theories as to why that's the case? You know, it sounds like it is kind of a baffling thing, but you know, what are some of your thoughts about, you know, why
I went through some really frustrating research while I was doing this book. And what's incredible is when I wrote the book, the equal pay for Latinas was actually better than it is today. And by better, I mean it was 53 cents to every dollar a white non-Hispanic man makes when I wrote the book. And this year, the new research is that Latina women have always lagged the farthest behind on equal pay. But this year, it's 49 cents to every.
So it's dropping.
Yeah, so it's dropping. And so now our equal pay day is actually December 8th, which means it takes us almost a year to catch up to a white man, which means we work for a year essentially free. And, you know, I think part of the conversation, and it was frustrating for me to write about this because this book is all about the equation that you can control, right? And I had written so much extra pages about what was structurally wrong and what institutionally and systemically needed to change. But I had to remind myself that this book is specifically on the part that we can control.
Like how to go in and just ask.
Right, but it's not that easy for us because we bring so much baggage to the negotiating table. So again, first and foremost, and the most important part is the systemic part of the problem, which we could literally spend hours talking about. But the other part, and it's the part that I hone in on, is the conditioning we have as women and women of color, where when we go into the negotiating table, we often go to the negotiating table with a lot of personal baggage. We bring this sense of guilt for asking for more. We do this thing where, by the way, one of the things that we're the most scared of is causing dissonance, because as people who have felt like the other, we've seen the repercussions of causing other people cognitive dissonance. So we've almost conditioned ourselves to create ease for somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about how that translates into the negotiating table, what's the first thing you do? You make your ask, and then there's that incredibly awkward silence,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And for people that don't like to make other people feel uncomfortable, our initial reaction is to just say, oh, but it's fine. I mean, if you want to, discuss the number, I can be flexible, right? Instead of just like letting the silence sit
Yeah.
and the awkwardness sit. Because, research shows that when you are the person making, and this is so funny because I learned this little tip when I was doing Mary Kay when I was 18 years old, and there's so much research behind this now, but when you let the silence sit and embrace the silence, it actually helps you control more of the negotiating power. It also makes it so the person that you are negotiating with to come towards your side a little bit more. So this book is like filled with little tidbits of things that are our natural inclination and our natural conditioning when we get into the negotiating table, and even before then, where we give away our power. And that's just one example. Yeah. But the other thing is that we're so used to also just waiting till we're in the negotiating room or until we're vouching for a new job to make our pitch and to show other people what we're doing and how great we are. And it's so funny because I recently went to Chile like 2 weeks ago, and I don't know if any of you guys follow me on Instagram, but I had this conversation with my grandma from Chile. And she was saying, we were talking about like whether or not you should brag about yourself at work. Mm-hmm. And she's like, absolutely not. That's, that is so off color and that is so obnoxious. You only do it when you're asking for something, negotiating, or when you're interviewing for a new job. Right? So that is the lesson that many of us have grown up at. My grandma and my abuelita, my grandma, great, smart women, but things like we have to be grateful and overly grateful for everything and stay in people's good graces and put our head down and do the work and, expect for someone to notice. No one's going to notice in corporate America. So again, it's all of these conditionings that are so natural for us that come up in really inopportune times when it comes to asking for more and getting our value back that work against us. And I think that a lot of women nowadays are figuring that out. Yeah. Right? When you look at quiet quitting, when you look at the Great Resignation, a lot of those women are women of color that are doing that because there's a burnout. Yeah. There's a burnout.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that resonated with me in the book, and I feel like I've joked about this myself, is imposter syndrome. Yeah. Where you kind of can't believe you've gotten where you've gotten, or you don't feel you deserve it. Maybe you're lucky. Talk a little bit about how that feeling might affect women reading the book, but also affected you in your career.
Yeah. Well, I've always felt like I shouldn't be there. Yeah. I mean, I came into the system as somebody who shouldn't be here. It's very clear. Like everybody told me, you do not belong in this country. Like it was that clear to me. Yeah. So that sense of imposter syndrome was something that I had a lot of practice with. Yeah. Yeah. But imposter syndrome, and I spoke to many inclusion and diversity experts, and I went back to the initial research of imposter syndrome in the 1970s, which actually didn't include women of color in the research. And imposter syndrome is I think it's been like a buzzy term nowadays. Yeah. And the research shows that actually men and women suffer from imposter syndrome. But when we talk about women of color and imposter syndrome, it's a totally different dynamic. Yeah. Because women of color, and especially Black women, and women who are, different skin tone, when you tell them that what they're suffering is imposter syndrome, when they feel like they don't belong, you're missing an equation of the conversation there. You're missing the part of the conversation that has to do with microaggressions, with work slights, with toxic environments, with prejudice, with bias. So I don't think it's necessarily fair to talk about imposter syndrome in a blanket way for women, because it certainly doesn't affect women the same way. Yeah. And I think that's hopefully the distinction I made in the book.
I think you made that very clear. I want to talk a little bit about finding your purpose. You address this in the book. So walk us through, how does a person find their purpose? That's not always the easiest thing to do.
Yeah. And I think that why is always constantly changing. Yeah. And I feel like people nowadays, and I mean Gen Zers out there and millennials, like we're so fixated in finding that why and finding our purpose, because we are people who want to make an impact. We've seen how, you know, unfair the system has been for our aunts and our moms and our grandmas, and we want to use all of the advancement that they've done, and we want to make it worth it.
Yeah.
We want our individual sense of worth to have an impact. And you take that messaging and you put it to children of immigrants and immigrants themselves, that sense almost doubles in sense of responsibilities. And I always say, to find your why, it is so important to take other people's expectations out of the equation. And especially for immigrants, we come in and we have this sense of generational duty, and we put it on our shoulders, and it can be blinding to what it is that we actually want to do. And it's okay if your why, and I talk about this in the book, not everybody has the same why, and everybody feels like, oh, the why has to be about changing the world and making an impact and changing somebody's life. That's fine if that's your why, but some people just want to make money. Yeah. Some people want to be financially independent, or they're in a creative field and they want to make money so that they can have a family and enjoy their family. Yeah. And I think hopefully that's the conversation that I open up in the book, is that our whys have many different layers, and we really have to, you know, quiet the mind from other people's expectation and what social media talks about and all these different ideas, because it's really easy to be clouded by other people's expectations. Yeah. And you know, the other important bit of it is that your why can change. Yeah. I think my why, for example, is being a storyteller, and that has taken a lot of different variations. And for somebody like me who, for a long time, it's really hard to understand what I do. Like, I think for a lot of people, for a long time, I didn't make sense, right? So I was a producer, but I was also doing non-air, and I was also a contributing writer to Know Your Value, and I was like doing this book, but I also worked in news. Like, people didn't know how to, you know, create a box for me. Yeah. And maybe it was self-imposed that I felt like people are not going to understand me, they're not going to like me, right? Because that's our biggest fear, is not being liked. Yeah. And for a long time, I felt like I was not going to be taken seriously at my job because I was doing all these other things. And God forbid, these people at work who were news people, right? If I wasn't that, you know, straight line news person, then I would never be taken seriously. But what I needed to know, and what I've found out now, and I really leaned into it, is that as a storyteller, embracing all these different facets and ways that I can be a storyteller, whether it's in linear on TV, whether it's, you know, writing, whether it's getting out in the field and talking to people, all those things go back to the same thing. And it's whether I'm talking about my own story, or whether I'm putting other people on TV as a booking producer, or whether it's going out in the field and telling other people's stories. It's just storytelling. Yeah. And I think for me, the most important thing, even if I'm talking about my own story, it's about having other people be reflected in those stories. And at the heart of it, it's so that people don't feel alone. Yeah. Because it's a feeling that I knew really well. Yeah. And that, I think, is my why. But you can see that has a lot of different layers to it.
Absolutely. How does a woman of color balance likability and power? I think you do address this in your book, so talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. It's like the Likability Trap.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys know Alicia Menendez, but she wrote it. She's one of my mentors too, and she's a host of MSNBC, and she wrote this great book called The Likability Trap. And it's something that we have to lean into and you know, hit it right on the head, because we are never going to make everybody happy. Right. And if we're leaning towards that sort of sense of, oh, I have to be liked, we're going to miss out. We're going to lose our power. We're going to get the short end of the stick. We're not going to be given what we're worth. Because if we're talking about money, you know, when you go in there, and I think about Mika and the whole platform she built around Know Your Value, she pissed off a lot of people when she asked for more at the beginning of her career, right? Because for many different reasons. Yeah. And that's the sort of conundrum we have to face. But again, we have to go back to what it is that we're asking for and why, and really depersonalize it.
Yeah.
And understanding that if we're talking about asking for more at work, and especially money, at the end of the day, it's not about us. It's about an exchange of goods.
Yeah.
You were hired for a specific thing, whether it was your soft skills or your technical skills or whatever it is, it's an exchange of goods. We are an LLC. When we go into the workplace, we're exchanging goods, and we have to take care of that LLC. That is us,
Yes.
right? And when we differentiate our personal sensibilities of like, oh, I'm gonna hurt this person's feelings, or oh, I'm not gonna be liked, oh, I'm gonna make somebody uncomfortable, has nothing to do.
Yeah.
It's an exchange.
Yeah. I think one of the stories that is sticking out now as you talk about this, that you I think it was in the chapter also on, I think, pay, where we address pay, is how when you were offered a promotion at work, I believe it was from producing to being a junior booker, they offered you less pay.
Yeah.
And I mean, that just kind of shocked me. I'm like, how could you promote somebody but not also give you a commensurate salary? So how did you work through that? Talk about, how, you came back with, your value, instead of,
Yeah.
you ended up with that job, and I imagine
Yeah.
you ended up with hopefully the pay that you wanted. So talk
Yeah.
about your strategy there.
Well, I'm very thankful for having, again, a mentor who speaks about this issue, who was able to, advise me in this.
Yeah.
And what happened was, when I was a production coordinator, I think I hit like a record for the overtime that I did, because I was always saying yes to everything. And it worked to my benefit, and when I was hired for the next thing, they wanted to, the salary band was less than what I made overtime.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I had tons of discussions with my boss, and I was ready to walk away, because I knew that it wasn't just about that salary, right? Because I had done enough research with equal pay, and knowing that a woman like me is at the bottom of the total totem pole when it comes to equal pay, and to know that young women start out earning less than their male counterparts and never really catch up. I knew that this wasn't about that moment. This was going to accumulate if I didn't, ask for what I wanted and what I thought was fair. And I was ready to walk for that reason. I didn't want to walk because I loved that job there, but I was ready to do that because I saw the bigger picture. And it's a hard thing to do, right? It's not black and white. Some people really can't say no to their jobs.
It's super scary to just be ready to walk.
But I knew that, again, there was a larger thing happening, and that I was part of being a statistic, and I didn't want to do that.
Talk a little bit about what you've seen in the pandemic, in terms of, it's always a struggle in the workplace, but, has the pandemic and working from home caused any new problems for women of color in the workplace in terms of asserting your power and feeling like you're belonging and being able to make sure that your value is recognized when you're all separated? What's
interesting is, I think I've done a lot of research on this in the past 2 years. I have no sense of time, so I think it's been 2 years. There are mixed feelings about this, and I think it's generational as well, because one of them is the caretaking thing. Caretaking thing, the child care issue is a huge thing that we can't not talk about when we talk about the things that are the people, how people are affected, especially women of color are affected during the pandemic. But the other thing, and it's a positive, I think, and I wrote about this in Cosmo, this piece about how we've valued our productivity and how we've equated our value on our productivity. And I have a whole chapter on mental health and survival mode in my book, and it's because a lot of our communities have grown up in survival mode, and survival mode is a conditioning where you are constantly with adrenaline. You're constantly feeling like you're not doing enough. It's hard to shut down that fight or flight mode. because it's not only us that have been on a hamster wheel of like trying to get as many opportunities as we can, but we've also seen our families do it that way, you know, and seeing my parents work at two and three jobs, it was normal, right? That was what, you know, I grew up knowing that would get us to success, right? That model minority sort of symbol. And I remember right before the pandemic, I got vertigo, which was, I don't know if anybody here has gotten vertigo, but it is just the worst thing ever. And the doctors didn't know what it was. They just said it was, you know, some sort of inflammation, which could have been caused by stress. But I was just going, and I was going to all of these things that had nothing to do with my job, and I was just saying yes to everything. And I realized when everything slowed down, and I think it's what many women realized, is that we were giving our time, our energy, our money to things that didn't give us value back. And I think a lot of us were better able to discern that. And I have a mentorship community called Acceso Community, which one of my members is here today. And one of the things that we talk about is when to discern when things are not giving you value back. And that's really hard, especially because you want to be that likable girl, that team player, the one that accommodates everybody, that doesn't want to cause dissonance, right? So it's hard to take a step back and push back to the initial point that I made. But I think a lot of women now are realizing that they've given away a lot and have not given themselves back the value that they've, you know, sent for.
You're draining yourself.
Yeah.
So I do want to open it up if there's any questions in the audience, and if there's not, I'll return to my questions, but I wanted to give audience a chance to ask questions. So we don't have a mic, so just as loudly as you can ask.
Group. Yeah. We can hear you.
We can hear you.
I was always the kid in elementary school that they put in the lead of the play, so I think you'll be able to hear me. Thank you for coming and for writing the book. And my question for you is, how is it different for male undocumented immigrants? They must have some of the same burdens as the women, but maybe they don't get into the good girl likability people pleaser mode as much? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I'm glad you asked about that. I actually do think they suffer from that as well. I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of undocumented people and DACA recipients after my first book with Mika, because I talked a little bit about my experience in that book. And when I would do events, I was so surprised when I would have men come up to me, and DACA recipients, formerly undocumented men, Asian men, Middle Eastern men. And I think that feeling, that's why I called the book The Other. And I remember when I did the audiobook for this, I had a very incredible audio engineer. His name is Charles, and I have this on my social media. But he was an African-American man. And, you know, he had no other choice but to listen to the book, because he was, you know, he was producing the engineering, the audio engineering for the book. And at the end, he told me, you know, I know I'm not the demographic for the book, but I learned a lot, and it really resonated with me. And I've felt like this all of my life. And I had the same reaction when I was interviewed by this Latino man who said the same thing about the book when he read through it, because he was going to interview me, and he had that same feeling. And so I know the title is, the subtitle has the word women of color, but you know, I have mixed feelings about that, because I'm a white Latina, and in Chile, I'm not a woman of color. I'm just a Chilean, right? And so I think here in the U.S., I fall under that category of a woman of color, and I am very upfront about talking about my own privilege as a white Latina. And that is why in the book, you know, there's anecdotes from other women, Middle Eastern women, Black women, Asian women, and members of the LGBTQ community who are felt like the other. And so beyond women of color, I think this has a greater and broader sort of blanket of people that this applies to, including men.
And I think it also applies to just white women who are
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I had a book come out last week on the history of misogyny, right? And answers. It's the same stuff, I think, for most people.
Well, it causes dissonance.
Yeah.
We're terrified of dissonance, especially, I've worked with so many women in my mentorship community that are white women who work in male-dominated environments, and the moment that they, speak out of turn or they say something that is direct, right? They say something, they mean what they say and say what they mean. That's what men do, right? Or we write an email without exclamation points. Oh, she's so aggressive, right? That's what they say. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is that we as women all have a responsibility to push back on that, because we as a whole, when we fit into that image of what men want from us, that, accommodating team player, has to be likable, we are confirming a bias, right? So every time we lean into that stereotype, we are confirming it to the people around us. So we are, we're causing a disservice to all the other women because we're confirming that stereotype of what we should be. And again, I try to do with, I'm iffy about saying that because it's not our fault, right?
Right.
But again, it's the part that we can control too.
You don't want to invite conflict and tension, but sometimes it's helpful if you do that a little
Yeah.
bit.
I mean, I've been told I was aggressive before, and you can see me. I'm very passionate when I speak, and I'm very direct, but it comes off as aggressive sometimes. But you know what? I'm just like, okay, that's fine. What somebody will call aggressive, another person will call passionate.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you can't make everybody happy.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience?
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for my
Aw.
My question is, now that we're we work virtually, communicate virtually, like via Zoom or Teams, how do you negotiate, or do you have any tips on negotiating in virtual?
Yeah. Well, first of all, don't wait till you're in the negotiating table to talk about what you've done and how you've done it. In this kind of remote work world, managers, to be honest with you, have a hard time delegating, managing everybody, keeping up with everybody. There's a disconnect, and they have a hard job because they're trying to figure it out as we go. So I think this is actually a really great opportunity for us to keep our manager in check and actually gain more power and influence as we do that. So one of the things that I love advising women is every week, give your boss a progress report. In a way, because sometimes in person that would have felt like weird maybe to go into the office and say, oh, by the way, I did this, this, and this. Now you can do it in a way where it's like not just okay, but it's necessary to do those things, to keep your boss appraised and to remind him what you're doing, and to use this excuse of like, oh yeah, I know I'm only going to the office 2 or 3 times a week, or maybe you're not going into the office at all. I just wanted to make sure that I want to help you out and make sure you know what I'm doing so that you can get a better picture of what's going on in my department or in my specific role. Do it weekly, do it bi-weekly, do it however you feel is necessary in your role. And the other thing is, don't be afraid to take the no and figure out how you can turn it into a yes. Because I think one of the things that I found really empowering is I've gotten no's before, whether I was negotiating or trying to change somebody's mind or whatnot. But I think one of the things that is really powerful is that when you get a no from your boss on something you're negotiating on, or not just money, but maybe you're asking for more flexibility, or maybe you're asking for a raise or more responsibility, whatever it is, it could be a bad time for the company. But oftentimes we don't want to be a pest and we say, okay, and then we run out the door. Instead of that, hold them accountable and say, okay, what was it that made you think that I wasn't ready for X, Y, and Z? Tangibles. What's the metrics that you're using in order to get me, in order to, fill those gaps? And get really specific about what they're looking for. And then after they say that, ask them about a time where you can check back in. Because we don't want to wait a year, right? Oftentimes we wait that full year for that next progress report, right? Or the evaluation that we have yearly. Ask them, when's a better time? I know this is whatever excuse they give you. Oh, it's a bad time for the company, we're not, blah, blah, blah. Okay, great. Well, when's a better time? 2 weeks, 3 months, 6 months? When's good? And put it in their calendar right then and there, right? So you can have that progress report and you hold them accountable. Because they're not going to come up to you in 2 months and say, oh yeah, by the way, that conversation we had with you, let's revisit that negotiation. No, they're not going to do that. So, be very specific about when you can check up with them again, when you get the no.
Great. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, Alan.
Hi.
What's been your experience with career development? Once you've been hired, you're on the job. Have managers been investing in your career, giving you training or reimbursed
Yeah.
skill
Mhm.
training or stretch assignments or
Yeah. So right. So I work with Mika Brzezinski, who is just an incredible mentor and sponsor, and it's just a great example of what women who want to help women should look like. I mean, she's advocated for me in rooms that I have not had access to, which is incredibly important. But at the same time, there are things that I've done that have accelerated my career. So my equation part of it, I went from a production coordinator to a booking producer to a reporter in a very kind of non-linear way. So I think to your point, one of the things that I had to take up on myself is when I got a seat at the table, especially when I was in my booking producing job, I had to show people that I could do reporting when I wasn't a reporter. And I think I had to get through that idea of not making sense to people, because what I would do is, I would go to the presidential debates and I would be there, after the debates were over, and I would stay till like 2 a.m. to try to get the candidates, to get them to come to the show the next morning. That was my job as a booking producer. But I took advantage of being in places like Nevada and Los Angeles and tried to find stories, political stories, that I could do like a man on the street thing, because it was the least heavy lift.
Yeah.
And I would go to my boss and say, Nevada is a really important state for Latinos, and they could be making a huge impact in the upcoming elections. Can I do a man on the street? And he's like, okay. I mean, like, he had no reason to say no, so he said yes. And I would get there early. I would do these interviews, and instead of going back to dinner with my colleagues, I would go back into the room, my hotel room, and I would do the transcripts, and I would produce it and send the materials for the show the next morning, where nobody else had to do anything but just like put play and have it on air, right? Yeah. And that's the thing, when you're trying to make sense or when you're trying to pivot into something new, you've got to hand people to things on a platter. Yeah. The same thing, I had another example is when I was on the Forbes stage, the 30 under 30 Forbes stage, I was invited to do a financial talk with 2 other more qualified women than me. One was a New York Times bestselling author on financial wellness, and another was a CEO at AARP. And I was somebody who had written for NBCnews.com on my free time, but I'd spent a lot of years doing that on the side, and I had focused on financial wellness with the lens on communities of color and immigrants. Because I found that going back to my earlier point, the way that financial wellness was being talked about didn't include the aspect of caretaking and immigrants, and this idea of, like, I'm going to be paying my mom or sending my mom money and my grandma money till the day I die, right? Because it's just what you do when you're an immigrant family or you grew up Latino. You send money back to your grandma. Like, that's what we do. So financial wellness is there's a different lens to it. So that's why I was brought up on stage. And I remember that day, we had a great talk, and then that night I got an email from Serena Williams' publicist, because Serena was there with a financial wellness company. She was their ambassador, and she was doing the Master of Ceremonies or she was the main speaker for the Forbes conference the next day. And the publicist reached out to me and said, hey, we saw your talk on financial wellness. We saw that you have a specific, you're talking about communities of color. Serena's here doing something, talking about something similar. We're giving one interview. Do you want to take the interview? And I was a producer. Like I wasn't a reporter for the network, but I took that opportunity and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna figure out how to do this. So I saw like cameras around the event. So I was like, okay, there must be some sort of crew here. So I called up Forbes, one of the chief operating officers, and I said, can we use your cameras? We'll brand the event. It'll be on Morning Joe. And I produced my whole segment. I got Serena in. I only got like 5 minutes with her. But I called my boss and say, hey, I have a crew. I produced it, and I got an interview with Serena. Can you put it on Morning Joe the next morning? Again, they had no reason to say no.
Yeah. Well,
and so it was a bunch of like buildups of these opportunities where I just tried to prove myself.
Yeah.
And it eventually, I had enough of those things where they couldn't say no when, I asked for a reporting job. It took like several years, but there was a little bit of people advocating for me behind the scenes, but there was also a big part of the equation where I kind of controlled my narrative and my messaging.
And almost like it instills trust, like, look what I've already accomplished. Let me just get this to the finish line.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, I know we're almost out of time. I did want to ask you, what is next for you in your career and your life at this point? You just finished your book. So what are you looking at?
Yeah. Well, getting the book out to more people that need it, getting it out to more people that want to help people of color, women of color, and don't necessarily know how. I think there's a lot of initiatives that have lofty goals about diversity and inclusion in today's corporate world, but this is an opportunity to do it in a way that's really substantial. Growing my community, Accesso community, that I started in the pandemic. I'm the only person behind the scenes there, so I want to grow that once this book. I have several months of this book under my belt, reporting on Morning Joe, and who knows, maybe more books under my belt. We'll see.
All right. Well, we look forward to the next one if there is a next one. Before we conclude today's discussion, let me take a moment to thank Headliners co-team leaders Donna Lineman-Legere and Lori Russo, as well as Headliners member Peter Copeland. Club Communications Director Kate Helser, sitting right here in the front row, and Club Executive Director Bill McCarran. We also hope you can join us on Thursday, September 22nd at 6:30 p.m. for our discussion with Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post reporters Scott Hyam and Sari Horwitz, authors of American Cartel: Inside the Battle to Bring Down the Opioid Industry, and Beth Macy, author of Dope Sick and Raising Lazarus: Hope, Justice, and the Future of America's Overdose Crisis. And now for the last question. You work really hard, and it's all about finding balance these days. So what is your favorite way to get some downtime? What do you do during your downtime?
Hang out with my dog, Benji. He's my little rescue. I miss him so much. I've been trying to get into the meditating thing. I don't know.
It's not sticking yet?
I've tried, movement, eating well. I'm a work in progress.
All right.
Yeah.
And with that, I will present to you the National
thank you.
Press Club mug, and hope that we will see you here again soon.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.